of the most important pieces of advice I could give to them is develop your professional network. It is true that the best jobs are not advertised. The best opportunities are not necessarily the ones you're going to find in, jobs.com or any of those other job sites. The best opportunities are people passing you uh, potential opportunities. Like, for example, these two startups that I'm involved in, I did not apply for them. People reached out to me based on my experience. And they said, Frank, you've got a skill set that we think would be helpful to achieve our objectives. And I was only able to do that because I had my network. It was kind of interesting. In one of the startups that I'm involved with, we were at an event, and we really used that as an opportunity to network with people. And coming out of that conference, we have 3 meetings with venture capitalist funds to get additional funding. So again, start early. I mean, I'll be blunt with you. Some of the contacts that I had going from back to college were critical to my later success. For example, one of my closest friends and colleagues was chief of staff to Senator Bob Menendez when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in his personal office. In 2014, my nomination for Assistant Secretary of State got stuck in the Senate for nothing to do with me, but ensuring that I had that personal contact was critical to get Senator Reid to move my nomination forward. It's so funny. I'm going to tell you a couple of two great. I'll leave you with 2 great stories. The first is this. When I was 17 years old, the one thing I wanted more in life than anything else was to go to Georgetown University. My entire raison d'etre, as the French would say, reason for being, was to go to Georgetown. And I remember in April of 1990, I was in Boston, and I called my mom and I said, Ma, did I get anything from Georgetown? And she said, Frank, you didn't get in. And I was just devastated. I said, the world is over. I cannot go on anymore. Danny, do you know where I was when I found that out? I was at an event for Senator John Kerry, okay? I worked on his campaign in 1990 when I was living in Massachusetts. 25 years later, we're on the stage at the State Department in the Benjamin Franklin dining room, and he's swearing me in to be Assistant Secretary of State. So I always tell these younger folks that, one door closes, another opens. Another story that I'll share with your audience is back in 2008. When President Obama was elected, my plan was to try to go back over to the Pentagon, where I had come from, to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Forces and Missile Defense. And I had had some discussions with the transition team about going over to deep. And this is just a funny story. So I was working for Ellen Tauscher at the time on the Armed Services Committee. I told her, Ellen, I'm thinking about going over to DOD. She's like, that's great, Frank. So, but these things take time. And a couple of weeks later, her chief of staff calls me and says, Frank, has DOD offered you a job yet? And I said, no. Why? Oh, Ellen was just checking. But 2 weeks later, I'm getting ready to help her go to a trip to the Middle East. And she asked to see me alone. And I said, oh my God, what did I do? And she said, Frank. I said, Ellen. And she said, has DOD offered you a job yet? I go, no. She's like, well, I just got off the phone with Hillary Clinton. She and Hillary were actually quite close. And she's asked me to be the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. And I'd like you to come with me. And, when someone you respect who actually wants you to work for them asks you to come work for them, you say yes. I wasn't particularly all that crazy about going over to work at the State Department. But I will tell you, Danny, a couple of things came out of that. First, at State Department, I was very close to the undersecretary. So as a deputy assistant secretary and couple layers behind her, I had direct access to the undersecretary because I was working the issues she cared most about. Secondly, Ellen was a member of Congress. Members of Congress are not details people. They've got big sets of issues that they need to work. What they are really focused on is setting the strategic agenda and getting people like me to fill in the gaps. So as a result, she would set the strategic objective, but she would let me do all the negotiating. 99% of the actual work was me working, doing the details. And then when it was time to close the deal, we'd bring Ellen in to solve the last 2 or 3 political issues and then take the political credit, because she's the boss. And I don't know if I would have had that autonomy had I gone to DOD. And then 2 last points. At DOD, had I gone over to be the deputy assistant secretary, I would have been one of many people working those issues because at DOD, you don't just have the policy office, you have the acquisition and sustainment office, you have the joint staff, you have the combatant commands, you have the individual services, you have the defense support agencies. I would have been one small cog in a larger machine. Where at the State Department, I was the person who did space, missile defense, and a lot of the nuclear stuff. And then finally, had I gone over to the Defense Department, I almost certainly wouldn't have been the assistant secretary because they actually eliminated the position that I would have been ideal for. Whereas at the State Department, because for a variety of reasons, I was able to move up in the second term to be the assistant secretary. So, the last point is, go where the opportunities are. Don't box yourself in. If there's something that seems interesting, like going to the State Department or now working for a solar company, I never thought 10 years ago I'd be working for a solar company, but here I am. So follow the opportunities. And with that, let me stop there.